Good afternoon, everyone. Maybe before afternoon if anyone's tuning in from Hawaii or Alaska. Thank you for joining the NASIO-NARUC Grid Interactive Efficient Buildings Working Group Grid Interactive Efficient Buildings webinar. I'll give it just about another minute or so because it usually takes a little time for people to dial in. So hold on and we'll start in a minute or so. Good afternoon again. This is Rodney Sobin and Maddie Kohler at NASIO, the National Association of State Energy Officials. We welcome you to today's webinar, Grid Interactive Efficient Buildings Case Examples. This is being done under the umbrella of the NASIO-NARUC Grid Interactive Efficient Buildings Working Group, which I'll talk a little bit about in a couple of moments. We are very fortunate today to be joined by two leading presenters from two leading utilities performing leading-edge work in demonstrating grid interactive capabilities. You'll hear about several really interesting projects. We're joined by, from Xcel Energy, Eric Maurer and Neil Cowan, and from Southern Company, Jim Leverett and Justin Hill. I'll introduce them in a few minutes after a few other words. First, a little bit about logistics. All attendees are muted in silent mode, and we will have a question and answer session. When that time comes, please use the GoToWebinar question box to ask a question. Or there's a raise hand option to be recognized, and we do have the ability to unmute you to orally offer your question or comment. As is inevitable for webinars, there's always a question as to whether these will be recorded and slides posted, and the answer is yes. So these will be posted on the NASIO website. If you go to the events thing, underneath that there's a sub-menu, past webinars, which should take you to the recordings. Before going to our esteemed speakers, I do want to mention something about grid interactive efficient building opportunities. This will be a repeat for those of you who tuned into the last webinar. But we all know that advancing technologies are opening up a lot of opportunities for flexible load management, which can reduce costs, improve resilience, and reduce pollution emissions. It'll help grid operations by reducing peaks, moderating ramp rates, and providing various sorts of grid services while improving efficiency and allowing integration of renewable resources. The fundamental questions that we're interested in the working group is how can we optimize facility interactions with the grid? How can states fashion policies, programs, and regulations to advance such optimization? And what are roles for states, facility operators, utilities, product and service providers, and other stakeholders? To that end, we, with our colleagues and friends at NARUC, the National Association of Regulatory Utility Commissioners, developed a Grid Interactive Efficient Buildings Working Group. This has been generously supported by the Department of Energy's Building Technologies Office. Purpose is to inform states about GEB technologies and applications, to identify opportunities and impediments, and we're talking here about technical and non-technical issues, to identify and express state priorities and concerns, and to help states better understand sort of temporal and locational value of energy efficiency and distributed resources, and of course to improve energy system performance, including environmental reliability and affordability. This is one in a series of webinars. We are planning a number of briefing papers and other written products. We've had a series of calls with the member states of the working group, and we will be working with the states to advance potential roadmaps and pilots. And we are in discussions with Department of Energy on the potential for National Lab technical assistance for the states. I do want to remind folks about a roundtable and workshop that will occur at the NASIO annual meeting coming up in a couple of weeks or 3 weeks or so, where we will be discussing more of these topics, and we will also have a breakout session with the working group members. I do want to take a moment to recognize Casey Radcliffe and Hannah Terwilliger of Oregon and Minnesota, respectively, who are co-chairs of our working group. We have 14 states participating. There's a slide which you can look up at your leisure, which links to a page in which we have a number of resources and write-ups, as well as a summary of our interviews of the states. I do again want to note that we are doing this in collaboration with NARUC. So in addition to Maddie and I, Danielle Sass-Burnett, our colleague at NARUC, is also has a leadership position in this effort. So soon we will get to our main speakers, the people who you actually want to hear today. But let me give brief bios of them. Eric Maurer from Xcel Energy is a product developer. He develops new residential pilot projects to test new technologies and leverage existing programs to create new value for the grid. He's developed and filed pilots for EV smart charging, residential battery demand response, and the use of demand response and energy efficiency to defer distribution investments. Prior to working at Xcel, he was a manager at Rocky Mountain Institute's electricity practice, and he led energy strategy consulting projects with cities, states, companies, and was a co-author of the RMI book, Reinventing Fire, which I would commend to all the listeners. It's really pretty good. He will be joined by Neil Cowan, who is a regulatory policy specialist for Xcel and has been in this role since 2013, working primarily on renewables, energy efficiency, demand response, and data privacy issues. He has worked on regulatory and legislative issues for over 15 years in the energy and telecom industries. He's a Colorado native with degrees from Colorado State and University of Colorado, Denver. After the Xcel presentation, we will have two speakers from Southern Company. Jim Leverett is a senior research engineer with Southern Company's Building Energy Systems R&D group in Birmingham, Alabama. He is responsible for a research portfolio around residential and commercial HVAC, water heating, automation, and building envelope systems. He works extensively with customers, vendors, and external research organizations to evaluate pre-commercial technologies through both lab testing and field trials. He is the technical lead for the Alabama Smart Neighborhood Project, which you will hear quite a bit about. Prior to coming to Southern, he worked for a Rochester, New York-based engineering firm as a consultant to NYSERDA, and he also did consulting work for Entergy in Arkansas, managing energy efficiency and building response programs. He has bachelor's and master's in mechanical engineering from Tennessee Tech, is a PE and a certified energy manager. He'll be joined by Justin Hill, who's a senior research engineer in R&D at Southern Company and has been working in that role for 8 years. Justin manages company's R&D portfolio pertaining to buildings to grid technologies and integrating end-use devices into the grid. He is currently the technical lead for the Georgia Power Smart Neighborhood Project, which you will hear about, and other projects related to residential and commercial building integrations. He is also a PE in Alabama and earned a bachelor's and master's in mechanical engineering from the University of Alabama, as well as a PhD in interdisciplinary engineering at University of Alabama, Birmingham. So let me hand it over to our friends at Xcel. Eric and Neil, you're up to bat.
Thanks, Rodney. Just to give the lay of the land around where we're trying to head with our presentation, I think we wanted to provide a little bit of utility perspective on load flexibility and, as you all are referring to it, grid interactive efficient buildings, and where we are in the evolution of that kind of broad technology, where we're trying to go with it. Talk a little bit about a few different projects, in particular that focus on leveraging battery technology to provide value to customers in the grid. Talk about some of the regulatory and policy issues that are cropping up as we dig more into load flexibility and grid interactive capability, and then highlight some of the projects that we are moving forward with as we speak. Slide, please. So I think this picks up or maybe reiterates what we heard from Rodney in the initial introduction, which is, load flexibility is both increasingly important for the power grid and also increasingly available. And so I think on the availability side, there are a set of new technologies or technologies that have been around, but they are really starting to be adopted in greater numbers. And these technologies, of course, range from batteries to how we charge our EVs, more intelligent and sophisticated control systems, smart devices, distributed solar, and the list goes on. So there's a lot more capability that customers have at their fingertips. But there's also an increased demand and value to the grid, I think, in leveraging these technologies. And the depiction here is simplified, but I think the idea here is, whereas before load flexibility was a pretty simple thing, and the system wasn't quite as dynamic, we needed some capacity. But when we thought about energy efficiency, a kilowatt hour was a kilowatt hour, and we didn't really concern ourselves with when that kilowatt hour of efficiency came online. And I think now we care much more about the temporal dynamics of energy efficiency and load flexibility, because our grid mix is changing quite a bit. And we care about the locational element. We have new uses and sources coming online, whether it be EVs charging at level 2 or fast charging, or something like solar, that's not only changing the capability that we can provide to solve local problems, but also potentially creates local issues that we need to be cognizant of and think about how we manage. So, very important topic for us here at Xcel as we transition toward our different and new system and try and achieve our carbon goals. Slide, please. And this chart here is just a simple illustration of how we think about some of the evolution toward more flexible customer-facing programs that can help provide grid services. So on the one axis, we have grid applications, and on the horizontal axis, we have technology. And I think the place we're at today with many of our programs that relate to load flexibility is they tend to be focused on a single technology delivering a single application. So an example of that might be, our smart thermostat or our air conditioning switch programs to residential customers. They are AC-focused programs, and they really are about delivering peak summer capacity. In the future, and where our pilots that we'll talk about today are trying to go, is that next step where we're bringing on and engaging with multiple technologies, and we're not talking about delivering a single grid application, but perhaps multiple grid applications. So it might not be just peak capacity, it might also be some form of energy arbitrage where we're shifting loads into hours that have the lowest production cost. And the future, taking the next step, I think involves really integrating technologies and optimizing those technologies so you're able to stack multiple values in a more optimal way. So we're just starting down this evolutionary path to more and more load flexibility and more kind of complicated and capable load flexibility. Next slide, please.
And this is Neil. I'm going to step in here before we get rolling into more of the specifics around the Pena Station or in the Panasonic project, along with the Stapleton neighborhood projects. Quick mention to what enabled these projects to get off the ground, and I'm going to allude to the ICT project later on, or the ICT program, or the Innovative Clean Technology Program. And this program was established for the further development, commercialization, and deployment of new power generation and other advanced electric energy technologies. That's kind of the stated purpose of it. It's kind of the, I have always referred to it as it's the laboratory for new technologies before, even before they can really hit the ground in a pilot form. It goes back to 2009, and there we filed an application with the Colorado PUC to have a demonstration project at our old Cameo coal generator. If any folks know the western slope of Colorado, it's very hot, and the solar concentration is pretty good. So we decided we would try to do a demonstration project where we took heat generated from concentrating solar thermal, that facility, and integrate that with heat generated from the coal-firing generation unit. So it's an integrated generation unit. This essentially set up what we know today as ICT program. It brought together key stakeholders, NREL, of course, our commission staff, the Office of the Consumer Counsel, our ratepayer advocate, along with Western Resource Advocates, and I believe a couple others that were part of a kind of a core stakeholder group that, if these further projects were going to be proposed, that they would be involved in a stakeholder process. From that initial project, we've had a community energy storage project out at our Solar TAC facility, which is in the far out reaches of northwest Denver. There we were trying to study the impact of solar penetration, specifically distributed PV systems on the company's distribution system. That was done back in 2011, and that was kind of in the first, our solar rewards program at that time was a few years old, but certainly penetration of PV at that time was not that great. Then we get to our Panasonic project and our Stapleton project, both projects. We actually filed for that back in 2015 and been in testing since then. Again, a couple of the unique characteristics of the ICT program. We collaborate with a number of stakeholders. That was kind of set up, as I mentioned, back in 2009. Perhaps what makes Panasonic and Stapleton even more unique was we had even more stakeholders come to the table to make those projects happen. We not only had our regular advocates that we normally deal with, but we also had companies like Panasonic, Unicos, who's now been bought by another company, I can't remember their name, and the City and County of Denver. And so you had other interests that were brought together to make this actually a very unique and interesting set of projects. Lastly, I can't, from a utility side, what helps make this possible is certain degrees of deferred accounting cost recovery. That helps. Even though in the case of Panasonic and Stapleton, we had that ability also, but other companies came to the table with funds as well. So it was a very unique and very wonderful. Actually, when we went in front of the PUC, it was actually a pretty good story to be telling. So with that, I will hand it over to Eric to go through those with more detail.
Yeah, so the Panasonic project is a project that if you ever fly into Denver International Airport and are driving down to downtown Denver, you'll see Panasonic's headquarters building. So we located a 1 megawatt, 2 megawatt hour battery, which is the white boxes you see at the edge of this top picture, on the Panasonic's campus. And the battery is actually interconnected on the utility side of the meter. And it's really providing two things. One, we are testing it across a variety of grid applications, which we will talk about. The second thing it's providing is the blue box, which is the islanding switch, allows, if the grid goes down, the batteries actually provide backup to the Panasonic facility, even though it is a battery connected on the utility side of the meter. So it's kind of an interesting combination of providing a customer resource alongside, or a customer value alongside a resource that's really providing direct utility value. Next slide, please. As I'd mentioned, we are testing with the Panasonic battery a variety of use cases. These range from, microgridding the Panasonic building and providing that backup power to providing more traditional kind of bulk system value through things like peak demand reduction and frequency response. But then we're also, a big part of Panasonic is integrating the adjacent solar. So there is solar on the Panasonic building, but there's also, I think you can see in the background here, there's some solar on top of this parking facility. And so we're testing things like PV ramp rate limitations. So how do we smooth out the production profile of all of that local renewables on the system? Next slide, please. And this is just to say, across this range of applications, we are still in the testing phase, and that's also true of our Stapleton pilot that we'll talk about here in a bit. Next slide, please. And I should mention, and we can send out links to these things, but we do have a series of reports that we've shared with the PUC that talk about what we've learned from these pilots that are publicly available. So the Stapleton pilot takes a similar approach, but it is much more neighborhood focused. So Stapleton is the site of the old Denver airport. It's a 10,000 home master plan community, one of the biggest in the country, and also has a significant amount of rooftop solar adoption. So it's pushing 20% of the feeder load in this area. And so we thought it was a unique opportunity to install some neighborhood scale storage. So these tan boxes you see are batteries that range in size from about 70 kilowatt hours to 200 kilowatt hours. And we've been testing these batteries for peak demand reduction, and that's really from a bulk system perspective, but then also their capability to help us manage the rooftop solar that's loaded onto the feeder in this area. Next slide, please. And in addition to these neighborhood scale batteries, we've done a fairly small pilot, so 6 customers, where we've installed a Sunbridge battery system that's roughly 15 kilowatt hours, and been testing these battery systems for their ability to provide customer-facing services like rate management and backup power, but then also provide more grid-facing services like peak demand reduction and solar time shifting. Next slide, please. And I think we can skip this slide and go straight to the lessons learned. So these projects have been operational for 1 to 2 years, and I'd say for the most part what we're finding is that the technology, whether it's our Panasonic system that's provided by Unicos or our our home-based battery systems by SunVerge have been successful in providing the grid applications we're testing. I think the lesson learned for us that I think we continue to learn through the course of the operating phase of the pilot is these are definitely not, systems that are ready to, they're out-of-the-box systems. They're systems that require a lot of careful planning and integration to incorporate into our utility operating systems. And we've learned some hard lessons around communication and integration with our utility systems being a pretty important area that deserves a lot of attention up front to make sure that we can leverage our demand response management systems to operate these batteries in the field. And we've run into a number of cybersecurity issues that we've had to address with our different vendors, as well as some interoperability issues working across different cloud-based solutions. I'd also say I think we've learned a lot about the software-hardware integration, and in some cases we've just seen, hardware failures. For instance, our SunVerge systems, each of those 6 systems actually required a replacement of the gateway. So the same piece of technology failed in every one of the systems. Whereas our larger utility-sited systems, like the Panasonic system, one of the kind of biggest lessons learned was around how we control that system. And at this point, a lot of the control really needs to be manual around setting charge and discharge cycles. And some of that can be automated and can respond to automatic signals. But the control software tends to be in a place where if you want to execute a very specific type of control to charge and discharge, a lot of that needs to be accomplished in a more manual fashion than maybe we expected. So the pilot, is ongoing, or these pilots are ongoing, but I think it's been really instrumental for us to understand how ready for prime time these technologies are, and I think they're definitely progressing, but we don't necessarily feel like they are scalable at this point in time. But the technology, I think, is advancing every day. Next slide, please. I'm going to hand it over to Neil here to talk a little bit about some of the regulatory issues and policies, and then we'll maybe pass it to Southern after that.
Yep. So looking at the regulatory and legislative landscape, I've already mentioned about the innovative clean technology program that we have, and it's an example of a regulatory pathway. Unique, yet it does follow the normal regulatory calendar. So in the state of Colorado, that's anywhere between technically like 7 months, soup to nuts on a regulatory proceeding, but I believe actually with some recent legislation that's now even longer. So that's where we've been, and so that's kind of something that was created now 10 years ago. But we do have some new legislation that came about just over the last couple of years that helps enable further development. I have an example of our House Bill 18-1270, which is Colorado's Energy Storage Procurement Act, and that's essentially directed utilities to integrate storage planning within various planning processes. It also enabled the utility to look at up to 15 megawatts of rate-based energy storage to add those to projects. And currently, in front of the PUC, we have an application for such a program called our critical infrastructure program. Yeah. So that's an example of some enabling legislation. Also, we recently, through the last session, have Senate Bill 19236, which kind of follows along with the company's very aggressive carbon reduction goals. and allows for further integration of resource planning all the way from from big generation, your traditional resource planning, all the way down to distribution planning. And so that's been issued. It's a very lengthy piece of legislation that we'll be working with over, I'm sure, for maybe the next few years to implement. But that will definitely get you to go back to Eric's slide about integration. That's something that's directed towards that further evolution. Incentives, we always like incentives, of course. Deferred accounting, I mentioned in our ICT program, but also expansion and more expansion of targets or more goals and financial awards might be is part of incentives. Also, you can't forget ownership. That's another incentive that, of course, utilities would be looking at. Also, there's related investments, related to integration and stacking. Convergence over time will happen. We have a grid modernization, another grid modernization proceeding in front of the PUC today. It's called our Advanced Grid and Information Security, and that's been playing out with advanced deployment of metering and other technologies to integrate distribution grid planning. On the right side, we can look at limiters to this type of activity. And really, you can have legislation that can come about that kind of limits the ability to integrate. And there I would point to a bill that we saw back in 2018, which was an energy storage bill that actually limits integration by limiting the metering on energy storage systems. And while that was pursued for customer choice, we believe that essentially can be limiting in terms of integration. I think a couple other things that limit. We have RES and RPS goals that have been formed over, well over 10 years ago, and DSM goals that are actually very old as well. So those perhaps need to be looked at as well in terms of integration and advancing. Finally, I will just point to limited R&D that especially our company has, and the lengthy approval process that we experience with the commission. So I believe those are other examples of limiters for this type of activity. And with that, I'll hand it over to Eric. I believe we want to hand it over to Southern, right?
Yeah, we've got one more slide just on, there's a portfolio of new projects that target different grid applications and technologies. Happy to talk about that over Q&A, but Rodney, pass it back to you for Southern.
Thank you so much. That's really great. In the interest of time, let's go to your colleagues at Southern Company, and just to remind the audience that to use the question field in the GoToWebinar, as well as when the time comes, if you wish, use the hand raising function. So Justin and Jim, please take it away.
Hey guys, this is Jim Leverett with Southern Company. Rodney, if you want to go ahead to the next slide. Justin and I are working on the Southern Company Smart Neighborhood projects. We're doing a project with Alabama Power and a separate project with Georgia Power. And this slide gives you a little bit of an overview of what we're doing. I'll just summarize it this way, right? We have a lot of changes are happening on the grid. We just heard quite a bit about some of those changes that are in the future and coming down the line. And so about 3 years ago or so, Southern Company decided conceptually that we should do these projects to try to understand how do these changes that are coming down the line impact the utility, how do they change the way we interact with the customers, and how we do our day-to-day operations. We also wanted to remain the energy experts and understand these technologies better, or as well or better than other players in the field. And so what we are doing in these two projects is really three main items. We are looking at the impact and capabilities of distributed energy resources. Both in one project, we're looking at a community scale system, and in the other project, we're looking at a large number of individual home systems, so effectively nanogrids. The second pillar of the project is really high performance homes and smart technology. So how does the energy efficiency technologies coming down impact the utility and the customer? And how does smart home technology play into that? And then the last pillar is buildings to grid integration. So trying to understand what resources behind the meter can we leverage beyond just pure load control? Can we do ancillary services? Can we integrate with DER to choose the best option to keep customers comfortable and to reduce costs for the grid and the customers? If you want to go to the next slide. So the pictures on the left side of the screen are the Alabama Powersmart neighborhood. So we have a development of 62 homes. They were finished in July of last year. So they've been built and occupied by regular families for about 13 months now. In the bottom left, you can see the central community microgrid that serves that facility. It's about a half a mile away from that neighborhood, and it has a direct underground feeder connection to that community. That community is also connected to the grid, and it has the ability to island or resynchronize to the grid without impacting those customers at all. The homes are highly energy efficient. They're about a HERS score of 45, and that's without any renewables. That's just the energy efficiency features of the homes, which is accomplished through high performance HVAC systems, heat pump water heaters, 2x6 walls with R24 insulation, triple pane windows, and things like that. The two pictures on the right side of the screen are the Georgia Powersmart neighborhood project. So that project is taking a different view of this same future question. It's looking at 46 townhomes. You can see a few of them there in the top right. And each one of the townhomes has rooftop solar and battery storage on site. They also have multi-stage heat pump systems, heat pump water heaters, and quite a bit of smart home technology in the homes. And so really these two projects give us two dichotomies, two possible futures on how the grid, the utility of the future may end up looking down the road. If you want to go to the next slide. This is a satellite image of the Alabama Powersmart neighborhood. So you can see the proximity of the two assets you saw pictures of on the previous slide. It's about a half mile as the crow flies between those two. This project was finished and fully operational in July of last year. So it's been operational for about a year. And I'll show you 2 or 3 slides with a few things that we've seen that you might be interested in here right after this. The Georgia project, just to give you some additional background and context, started around the same time, but they ran into some permitting delays. And so they are in the construction process now. And so we'll be continuing that project here. It should be operational here by the end of the year, early next year sometime. If you want to go to the next slide. And then go ahead and advance it one more time. So in Alabama, the average home on a monthly basis uses approximately 1,300 kilowatt hours. There's a few caveats there in that we've normalized some of these numbers to do square footage comparisons, but in general, that's what we're seeing. And if you hit the next progression, that smart neighborhood that has been built in Alabama is using about 40% less energy than other new construction homes in Alabama. So I mentioned the HERS score is about a 45 in the smart neighborhood. Typical Alabama code is a 70 currently. So it's still about, so by just pure estimates, we would expect about a 35% energy reduction. We're actually seeing just a little bit more than that on average. A couple of other interesting things are those energy efficiency features in those homes, the insulation, the windows, the HVAC, the water heating. You know, we don't see a lot of that here in the Southeast, at least all as a package together. And it's not necessarily because of cost effectiveness. The smart neighborhood homes, the differential costs for all of the smart home technology and all of the energy efficiency was about 10% of the sale price of the home. And so it's a lot of money if you look at it from a retrofit situation, but when you look at it on a 30-year mortgage with energy savings, it becomes a different story. And so it's just very interesting to look at how much of an impact that relatively small amount of capital investment can have on the energy consumption. If you want to go and progress it twice more, we'll just go ahead and skip to the end here. A few of the homeowners in this community have electric vehicles, and so it's very interesting to look at the load when you compare those homes with electric vehicles to those without. So the electric vehicle in all the homes is the largest load in the home, or the second largest load in the home. And the homes with electric vehicles are using quite a bit more energy than those without. And so this pie chart on the right is really a projection. None of the homes out there have 2 electric vehicles, but it's really just saying, you know, in 10 years, maybe when some homes have multiple vehicles, we're really likely going to end up back where we started as far as energy consumption. There's a lot of talk about that in the industry as far as like, how does energy efficiency impact planning and design? And then you look at electric vehicles and it sort of changes the conversation about where things may end up in the end. If you go to the next slide, and we've got a neighborhood just down the road from the Alabama Smart Neighborhood, another new construction community, all electric, like these communities are. And that's what we're using as the baseline comparison. So if you progress it one more time, you can see the smart neighborhood line. So that's the shift down from the energy efficiency. If you progress it twice more, you'll see 2 of the homes in the smart neighborhood that have electric vehicles overlaid on top of those homes. So you can just see the magnitude and variation of the energy consumption on a typical day in January from earlier this year. If you'll go ahead and advance the slides one more time. This is just an interesting graph from the microgrid perspective. So we've been using that microgrid system in order to do islanding and resynchronization. And this is actually an event we saw that wasn't planned. So what you can see is on the left-hand side of the screen, the dark blue line has a massive dip. That's the basically, let me back up here. So the gray line near the bottom is the neighborhood load, and you can see it's pretty constant. The red line is the energy storage, the real power from the battery system. And then this blue line here is sort of the net energy usage between the microgrid and the neighborhood. And what happened is we had a fault upstream of the feeder, a squirrel got on it, and we had the battery basically instantaneously respond to meet that gray line. So the red and gray lines intersected. And then the solar shut off, which is that dark blue line. Whenever we transition from island to resync or back and forth, we turn off the PV because there's too much variance in that for us to easily handle it. So for simplicity, that's how we're doing it now. After about 5 minutes, the red line goes, the solar comes back online, and then the battery flips around to start absorbing some of the excess power because the neighborhood load was really low that day. And then around the middle of that graph, you can see we actually just resynchronized after the issue was fixed upstream. So it's just an interesting example of where that microgrid system was able to seamlessly provide backup power to that community when we saw an issue. The last thing on the very far right side of the slide, you see all the lines go down towards 0. We actually sent an intentional island command later in the day, and through operator error, we actually clicked the button a couple of times, and the software didn't know how to handle it, and everything crashed. And so there was a short outage in the neighborhood where we had been successful early in the day catching an unintentional event, and then at the end of the day, through user error and software UI design, we caused an outage. And I like to mention both of these things at the same time because there's still a lot of learnings to go on in the microgrid space, and we've got to work through a lot of these things that it makes sense, but is the software there, and how are things progressing? So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Justin to talk about some of the grid efficient and interactive buildings work. If you want to progress to the next slide.
Thanks, Jim. So on this specific smart neighborhood projects and really just the grid interactive efficient buildings in general, you look at it from, there's 2 potentially and likely competing objectives. So as a utility, we're looking at using these resources for grid benefit and for all these different use cases that we're trying to stack. But then at the same time, these homes are made for a purpose and people live there. So we're really fighting against keeping homeowners comfortable, keeping their temperatures where they want it, and keeping their water heater so they don't have a cold shower, those types of things. So we're looking at a balance between these two competing objectives, because really the primary objective is to serve the customer. Their home needs to be comfortable for them, convenient, and all those aspects of it. Then if you go to the next slide, in this project, we're looking at kind of how do you balance those two things. And so we're working with Department of Energy and specifically Oak Ridge National Labs, who's taking in a look from our grid and getting some data, converting that into something that's readable for the home energy management system, which is covered in the Voltron blue box here. And so Voltron's taking in that information and pairing it with weather data and customer preferences and temperatures and all these different things that are set up by the homeowner to make sure, or just kind of backstops to say, I'm comfortable at this temperature and I'm not comfortable at this temperature. So I'll give you 1 or 2 degrees to play around in here, but anything outside of that, don't touch it. And I'm available at this times for it, but not now. So it takes that information, it compiles it all together, looks out at a 24-hour ahead window and plans what's the schedule for the day that kind of meets both of these objectives. And then it takes that information, passes it back to Seismic here, which is our grid-facing controller. That information, Seismic then takes that information from all the homes in the neighborhood, just kind of anonymous, comes back as one piece of information. They look and they say, well, okay, but we really want to get this KW shed at 8 a.m. in the morning in the winter or 6 a.m. in the morning in the winter when we're hitting our winter peak. So we'll kind of negotiate again, and maybe we can preheat some water heaters and preheat your house a little bit if it's within your comfort constraints, and try to have that back and forth, kind of almost a negotiation strategy that happens behind the scenes. So we're meeting as many of the grid benefits as possible, but then also maintaining the occupant comfort and everything that goes on within the house. So then we go to the next slide. So while all this is happening, we're also capturing just as much data on these homes as possible. So this is an example of the dashboard that we created in Georgia Power, but we're collecting very similar, if not the exact same data in the Alabama project. So we're getting energy usage information on a minute-by-minute basis for pretty much every circuit in the house. So we're getting highly granular information about what's going on, what our impacts are. And then you can see things like the thermostat information. So we're integrating through the vendor APIs to have access to get information back and pass that on to the optimization algorithm so they can see what the temperature is, kind of learn how the house is performing and make smarter decisions on how you can balance that comfort and the grid benefit at the same time. So then we're collecting this for the 2-year window of the project, and you can go ahead and advance the slide. But we're collecting this for the 2-year window, and it kind of feeds into why is this something that Southern Company cares about. So the stuff on the right-hand side is really nothing new. It's Xcel talked about it earlier in the presentation, but it's really Southern Company came out, I guess it was last year, about the low to no carbon future and meeting that target by 2050. So this is just kind of one example of how we are looking at technologies, looking at new strategies of how we meet that goal as a company. And then also, Jim mentioned in the Georgia project, we have residential solar and residential batteries, but then also utility scale or community scale solar and batteries. Looking at the prices of those plummeting in the last maybe 5 or 10 years, and then continuing that progression. What does that mean to us? How can we use that as a resource for lowering our operating costs and understanding the potential to improve the grid resiliency, improve homeowner or home occupants' comfort and convenience and their energy productivity, while also reducing their overall energy costs and the cost that it takes to serve those customers. So next slide, please. This is an example of all the different angles we are looking at of grid-interactive efficient buildings for these projects. So if you start on the left-hand side here with the high-performance homes, We're really just interested in passively understanding how these higher efficient homes, better construction practices, new technologies with heat pump water heaters, variable capacity HVAC or two-stage HVAC, those types of things, just how they change the load shape. And does the higher thermal mass that's in the house, does that shift when your peak happens? Does that shift how your load shape looks back to the utility? So that one, we're just trying to understand what the future looks like just passively. Then the second column is really looking at, can we take the next step and not just look passively, but begin to actively manage how these devices or how these systems work. And again, going back to balancing homeowner benefit with utility benefit, but then using those resources for a resource to the grid and beginning to start down the path of creating a load shape from a utility perspective, rather than just accepting whatever happens from each home, accepting that back, but being able to at least at a minimum influence how that looks back to us. Then in the third one, looking at, Jim showed a great slide on just the amount of reduction in kilowatt hour cells and the potential revenue decline that kind of hits the utility industry with, and looking at how that kind of impacts our business going forward, but then also how do we take these changes, put it into better load forecasting and understanding kind of 10 or 15 years out what's going to be commonplace in the residential market and be able to plan for that. And then lastly, on this column, really just how do we price energy in the future? And I think that's always been a big question of mine, is that today we pay 10, 11, 12 cents a kilowatt hour for energy, pretty much no matter when we use it. Changes a little bit summer to winter, but nothing too far out there. And then we're slowly getting into time of use rates, where there's a few hours a day where it's more expensive for a few months of the year, and a little bit into demand rates. But is that enough, or is that the best way to price energy when you have all these devices that are connected, and you have a thermostat that can communicate back, and a water heater that can communicate back, and battery storage, and all these devices? Trying to understand what that looks like and how the future of pricing that energy actually looks. And then in the last column, looking at renewable energy grid integration. So in Southern Company's territory, we don't really have another example of 46 homes with 3.5 kW solar on each of the roofs in a centrally located area. So really just understanding what that means to our distribution system, to the design, as well as kind of functional or operational, how that changes things. And does that mean any of our infrastructure up front or long term needs to change? And then lastly, I'll say it once again, balancing the grid and the customer benefit for everybody, and making those renewable resources make sense for people to install for both the utility and the homeowner. The next slide. So this one really talks about the gap. So we've done a lot of work in the space, and we're starting to see some results on the interaction between or the evolution from direct load control into more sophisticated demand response into a true grid interactive efficient building. And these are somewhat specific to Southern Company, but I think they're pretty broad enough to cover the whole industry of just, we don't understand what the capabilities truly are and what all the grid services that this building can provide back to us. Making it easy on customers to install and get signed up for a program. I won't go through everything, but I'll hit on number 6. Do people actually care? Is this something that the convenience or the benefit gets outweighed by the impact on convenience or comfort or those types of things? So we're trying to minimize that impact, but at the end of the day, is it something that people care about it? Can we get enough value out of it to pass some of that value back on to the homeowners? And just different things with legal and data and regulatory, and how does that fit into our traditional business model versus new business model, and those types of things. So the next slide. And this is just a list that I started pulling together for this presentation. So I guess this is my take on how states can help advance this grid interactive efficient buildings program. And that's really just start by focusing on open standards and communication for control. So enabling these devices to become lower cost and interchangeable, and really just keeping options open for the utility, but then also on the homeowner side, so it gives them the flexibility to choose what's best for them while also having the dual benefit. So encourage the timing of energy usage. Xcel mentioned that one before too, is that now pure energy efficiency is important, but it's becoming more and more important when that kilowatt hour is used rather than just total annual amount of kilowatt hours. And then keep the customer as your number one priority, or the homeowner, or your resident of the state, however you want to look at it. The people that are receiving the energy, they're receiving this as a service, and they should be kept as the number one priority. And utilities, to capture the full value, to be able to stack these resources and have mechanisms to recover that cost, and then create incentives that make sense for your state. Don't just blindly throw out incentives for it, but only things that make sense for your state and your residents. And the systems approach to energy efficiency, where you're looking at it from the beginning to the end, with controls being at the end. And then I think that's my last slide.
Great, that's fantastic. A lot of good information, a lot of great experience you're gaining, which will be valuable for all of us who work with the states, as well as all your colleagues across the utility world. And I'd mention also the public power and cooperative utilities, as well as the IOUs. I believe there are some questions. Maddie, you have access to the questions?
Yep, we got a few questions, and I'm going to start with two that are specific to Southern, and then we'll end with a broader one about energy efficiency in GEB. For Southern Company, the two questions for you are, how do you anticipate the impact on energy load from EV charging on buildings? As EV adoption continues, will there be a negative impact on building load profiles due to increased charging?
This is Jim. I think that is something that we don't fully know the answer to at this point. We are obviously keeping a close eye on EV charging because of how large the load is relative to a lot of other building loads. But I think there are opportunities to incentivize customers to charge at better times. Obviously, sometimes you have to charge when you have to charge. But I think in general, for most customers, most days of the year, there's probably incentives, whether it's rates or other mechanisms that we can use to try to help shape that load a little bit better.
Okay. The other Southern specific question I want to pose is, do users have access to the smart neighborhood dashboard that you displayed earlier?
It will. We're currently developing it. That's the one that's displayed there is kind of a prototype or beta version of it, but we're actually meeting on that tomorrow to come up with a plan on how we roll that out for homeowners to have access to. So they have access to the individual data, but not presented in that format currently. We're working towards that.
We got a lot of good questions, but in the interest of time, I think I'll end with one that's broader than just to the many great questions we got to the specific projects. So the question is energy efficiency very important to the projects described by the speakers? Could they get the same grid benefits by making inefficient buildings more intelligent and interactive?
And we'll let any of you answer, maybe the Xcel folks, if you have an opinion on that.
Yeah, that's an interesting question. I was just talking with a colleague about that the other day. In some ways, you could imagine building load flexibility with an inefficient resource could potentially deliver more more capacity reduction, for instance, or more grid service on demand. I think we need to sort through that. I think there's still going to be a value for energy efficiency, and I think as some of the Southern project illustrates, I think the end game is still, you know, we need to optimize our buildings through efficiency, and efficiency is going to allow us to tap into hopefully more kind of interactive benefits of load flexibility. So you could imagine, you know, improvements in envelope allow you to do more creative things with load flexibility around your smart thermostat, for instance. I think that the interaction effect here, which we haven't really explored that much, hopefully, you know, shows that efficiency can provide extra value when we try and tap into greater and greater load flexibility.
Okay. Thanks. I'm going to another question. Oh, go ahead. Please go ahead.
I was just going to follow up on that. This is Justin from Southern Company, and I agree with what was just mentioned on the answer to that question, that it likely gives you more flexibility when you have less efficient equipment because you're dealing with larger KWs. But we were also looking at, in a separate project, interacting with heat pump water heaters versus electric resistance water heaters, and how the trade-off between the shorter runtime, higher KW, how that the pros and cons of that versus a lower kilowatt hour usage or lower KW usage over a longer period of time, and does the higher KW capacity of an electric resistance grid service outweigh the benefits of the kilowatt hour reduction of a heat pump water heater? We're trying to find out, but just on the surface, it seems like you get a better benefit from flexibility, the opposite direction on efficiency. So we're promoting that. But.
Okay. I'm going to sneak in another question here. What is the average cost of the homes and townhomes that are in the smart neighborhood? Were any of the technologies paid for by the utility?
The Alabama Power project, the average selling price is about $390,000, which is pretty comparable for that area of town. The Southern Company shareholders, not the utility, the shareholders actually did subsidize some of the incremental upgrades to those homes. And I think Justin, it was similar in Georgia. Is that accurate?
That's right. So in Georgia, I think the selling price was in the mid-500s. So it's, again, pretty comparable for the area. But their Southern Company shareholders paid for a good portion of the upgrades. There was a small-ish, or there was some money from Georgia Power Public Service Commission approved DSM funding for a portion of the upgrades to the project. So there was interaction with the PSC and talking to them, taking this project to them, and getting approval for that portion of the project.
Okay, that's great. There are lots of other questions, including many that I have, but unfortunately the hour is beyond an hour, so we're out of time. Thank you again so much, gentlemen, for this. I'm sure that I will be back with you about this topic. Thank you very much for these presentations. They will be posted. This is a lot of great stuff, and again, there's a lot to learn from this, and I think part of your message is that there's a lot of promise. It's looking pretty positive, these technologies and these business models too, but there's still more to learn. It's not quite ready for prime time, but it's getting in that direction. So thank you again, and thank you to all who tuned in today. Appreciate that, and hope to see some or many of you at the NASIO annual meeting coming up, when is it, September 16th or so, 15th, 16th, that week, in Manhattan Beach, California, and please keep in touch and have a great rest of the day. Take care, everyone.